Hi, welcome to the G Research Outreach Podcast, the Gross Out Podcast, where we gross you out about the details of working in open source. I'm Jay Faulkner. I'm your host, and I'm really excited today to be able to talk to someone who I've been working with for about 3 years here in the gross world, Tabatha. Tabatha, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've done in the open source space and what you do for G Research open source software?
Sure. So I am the G Research open source team's developer relations engineer. And so what that means for what I actually do is I sort of act as a representative for open source internally and kind of keep an eye out in the open source world for projects that need support from us, from the organization, and that we can support that way. My background in open source, I think like most people that work in open source, probably my initial start was as a user of open source. And this is in the late 90s, just working on doing dial-up tech support and working in an organization where we had to build everything ourselves, and starting with things like Radius. Moving on from that, I kind of found community with WordPress community not too long after that. And, for a number of years, spent a lot of time working, building community in WordPress. And then eventually I kind of got a position where I actually had the opportunity to work directly in an open source project, paid to do open source and build community for a security penetration reporting testing tool called Radius. I worked there for a number of years before I was introduced to G Research and the very cool work that our MOSPO does, our muscular OSPO. And I've just been really enlivened by the opportunity to continue working across various different open source communities and representing G Research and, like I said before, supporting the projects the best way that we can.
So that's interesting. It's so you start out with Radius. That's open source authentication of some kind, if I remember. Like what is that exactly?
Yeah, so that was used to manage our dial-up tech support users. This is, late 90s. This is where AOL didn't service. There were local ISPs that sprung up all across the country. And I got to work for one of them and helping to figure out how we were going to make it happen. I think that's core to everybody's story with open source is you look there first when you're scrappy, when you don't have a ton of money. That's generally where a lot of people kind of dig in to find solutions. And yeah, so from there it was just, I didn't really recognize it as open source. It wasn't that big of a deal at the time. And it was only in reflection that I realized how long I have been a user and contributing in some small way, even if it's through adoption, which is not a small way to participate in the open source ecosystem. Let me just go back and say that. But yeah, when I was getting ready for this podcast and thinking about my relationship with open source and how I came to it and relate to it, it really wasn't until I started working for Radius that I understood the enormity of the open source ecosystem. And then I was again just sort of blown away when I started working for G Research and participating in the open source program office here. And it's not just ecosystem, it's ecosystems. And understanding, you say it all the time, you hear it all the time in news articles and such, but 90% of the world's technology is powered by some sort of open source. And to have a part in that, however small, is incredibly significant to me. And it feels like just such a privilege and an opportunity.
Yeah, it's funny to think about. I've been sitting over here wondering if we need to do an explainer on what a dial-up internet is. Right. Back in the day when we had actual physical copper lines running everywhere and, literally call another computer on your phone to bring down the internet like in a minute per JPEG at a time or something like that. That was it's kind of interesting that you talk about ecosystem though, because I find, especially, working in hardware, that there's a really strong relationship between open source and open standards. Mm-hmm. And that sort of is interesting to me to reach into with you, having done that at the ISP with Radius. It's like, not only by adopting that software, I imagine you got a lot of stuff on the server side for free, but you also probably got compatibility with a lot of tools for free.
Yes. And while I didn't do too much of that work, I was thinking about the way that everybody has established, or in an ecosystem, you establish the ways that you work with one another within that. And within that world, you're right. It comes with sort of this pre-bundled methodology of how to interact. There's these sometimes explicit, but oftentimes implicit rules for not just your how you use the tech or the other ways that you can implement that particular piece of technology or expand your use cases into some way that you hadn't originally considered through others doing the same. But you also have to understand the rules of the community. And like it said, that's oftentimes they're implicit. So it takes a little bit of hunting around and understanding the ecosystem itself to be able to understand how to interact with it.
So when we talk about community, like what does that mean exactly to you? And has maybe what an open source community is, has that changed over the years? I think I'm going to point out a specific one. You mentioned that you had some history working with WordPress, and I think that might be a really good example of how things can change over time.
I feel like I'm hedging into dangerous territory talking about WordPress community in 2025. Now, to be fair, most of my experience with WordPress is like 2018 and earlier. It's been a number of years since I've been involved. For me, I used WordPress as a way to build a business for myself. I was offering WordPress website development and marketing strategy around your WordPress site and e-commerce, and it offered such an incredible variety of technologies that work together that I could use my own skills and layer on top of to provide services to small businesses. Right. So for me, having the community of other individuals that were doing the same, that I could discuss, this new plugin that had come out, or hey, there was this. How do we do this particular event management thing that this one customer of mine needed? Having access to individuals that have done similar things or have done adjacent things as what you're trying to accomplish is a large part of why I think it's important to seek out the community when you're starting to use a new tool or new technology. So how's that changed? How's community changed for me over the years? With WordPress specifically, I went from seeking the community and through understanding and a self-education. That was my first entry into that sort of community. But then I realized, or I learned, that there was on-site opportunities, that there was these things called WordCamps, and it was conferences that are built around supporting WordPress in that geographic area, right? So for me, I'm from Florida, and so WordPress Orlando was really my first opportunity to say thank you to the people that had been working, really like they paid to work on WordPress, and really passionate community members that were there to bring top tier names into Orlando, so that those of us that were here could learn from them and learn about the amazing things that they were doing, or the problems that existed in the community, or for a particular part of the project that needed assistance. It also became a way to connect with others about how to drive the community forward. There's always, when you bring together large numbers of people around one project, not everybody's going to agree on the best way to move that forward. And so understanding how to work within the framework of the community itself to bring change into place was something that I had picked up from WordPress. Now, whether or not WordCamps, and whether or not that same sort of feeling still exists, I can't speak to, but over time, how I interacted with the community definitely changed. I'm not sure if it was a community changing or me at that point.
Well, it's interesting. We talk a lot on this podcast with previous guests and stuff, talk about how open source can bring value to businesses and how to align and stuff like that. But you kind of touched on a critical part of open source, which is honestly really meaningful to me personally, which is the reverse, right? The number of people who were able to go community first and use that as a stepping stone to get into the industry, right? Like WordPress existing, making it easy to set up easy Easy by, standards of that time. I'm sure that today people would be scared of having to deploy a PHP web app on their own without a single push button. That's fine. But the ability to utilize that open source, to use those communities, to then take it and use them as Legos to build a career as an individual is to me just as meaningful as the ability for open source to sort of enable businesses to do cool things. How many people are there in the world like me or you who maybe got an introduction to the tech industry through these open source technologies? That's kind of an interesting bit to think about.
Yeah, I'm positive we are not alone in that. And in fact, I've presented at conferences with others in the open source community about how it can be an excellent entry point to your career or an accelerant to your career even. I was on a panel last October. I was on a panel with 4 other individuals, and we were all discussing how, particularly in open source security, there is just an absolute ton of work to be done and so many opportunities, so many ways to get involved in open source security that if somebody wants to make a name for themselves in that space, I'm not saying it's trivial to do. It requires rolling up your sleeves and doing the work. And there is a lot of opportunity there. And being able to see and identify people that have, maybe I spoke to them a couple of years ago at a conference and gently suggested this path because security is kind of where my heart lies in this whole open source space, that they might want to pair open source and another technology or some sort of concept like security. Really can, you can build a name for yourself pretty quickly, and for them to come back a couple years later and say, hey, I'm now hired at, XYZ company, and it's because of, this very obvious work that I have been doing that's easy to point to on GitHub, where I've gone and helped these 3, projects along and, tighten up their, whatever it is, it's just neat to see other people progress because of it as well.
So it seems like we've talked a lot about the impacts of community. It seems like, a lot of it is kind of soft. So is there a way that you can kind of quantify that or measure that?
We call those power skills, not soft skills. Quantifying, what do you mean? Quantifying the power of community?
How would you measure if a community is a successful, healthy community or not?
Oh, there's a whole project. There's a whole organization dedicated to that through CHAOSS. It's the community health. Oh gosh, I'm analytics for open source software. Yeah, there's lots of ways to quantify.
We'll make sure that we have a link to their website with their full name in the description below, or in the podcast description if you're listening.
Perfect. There's lots of you and I have had this conversation a few different ways of how do you measure a healthy community? When does a metric become a target? Are these the ways that you quantify a healthy community? Depends on what you seek to gain from it, I suppose. It sounds terrible coming out of my mouth that way.
Well, no, I actually like that a lot because it, the last person I spoke with for the podcast was Julia Krieger, who's the chair of the Open Infrastructure Foundation. And I think you're sort of getting to the point where the border between them, but it sounds like it's maybe important if you're a community, if you're trying to establish a community or build a community, to think about what things you care about, right? Because that seems like what you're getting at, right? You have to know what you care about in order to get or to measure that goal.
Absolutely. And depending on, what the goals of the community are, it may not always align with, if you're an organization, if you're a business, it might not align with your goals. And perhaps the way that you would measure the health of that particular community don't align with how that community itself is measuring their own success and being healthy. It is important for a community to understand, or for a project to sort of have a bit of an end goal in mind when they're thinking about, finding more contributors to it, finding more participation, finding individuals to adopt it. I mean, that's the selling point to me. For an organization, for a business, is the community that a project comes along with. So evaluating that on, there's not one number that I can look at that says, oh yes, this is a healthy project. This is a healthy community. Looking at a large community where there's lots of participation doesn't guarantee that it's a healthy community either. There's plenty of examples online of incredibly toxic open source communities. We won't talk about those, but they definitely exist. If the project fits what you're needing to do technology-wise, but the community is terrible and you can't get any support, and even if you are, putting together really well-crafted pull requests that align with the issues that the project purports to want fixed, there's no guarantee that that community is going to merge anything for you or do anything for you. There's a bit of politicking that you need to do in that community that doesn't align with how you are enabled to move through that space or doesn't align with your values.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because in some communities, it almost seems like they don't want to be a community, right? Like it is maybe a single organization or a group of like-minded people who have a very specific goal in mind, and that goal might not include, involving other people or involving other ideas or other use cases in that. And that's an important lesson that I think maybe a lot of people starting out in open source might learn the hard way, is that, put up a PR, you assume it's good. You're like, hey, I'm giving them something. But the reality is that, unless that community has a goal of getting that feature implemented or getting changes merged from an external contributor, that can actually be a really rough thing.
Yeah.
Which, I know you've kind of worked some in like community and metrics. You've worked some in security. And so I sort of think about the intersection of those places with there was the recent incident in the XZ community of where they actually had someone go on a dedicated 1.5 year campaign to gain trust and then to abuse that. So where does kind of security and community intersect in terms of, protecting a large vital piece of open source from that kind of attack?
That particular attack, that was a long con, right? But that was an incredible dedication to try to do something that absolutely the impact of it would have been incredibly damaging to a lot of organizations, or had the potential to be incredibly damaging. How do you protect from that? And 2020 vision on this one, it's really difficult, right? It's really difficult, especially in a world where your contributions know no boundaries. Right? You don't want to look at an individual and say, oh, just because they're in this particular bit of geography, that I can't accept contributions from this individual. Looking at how the project is built, looking at how the longer history of how the project is organized, I think only somebody that had been paying attention through those years and had seen the potential for maintainer burnout, recognized the signs of maintainer burnout, and understood the risk of a new individual that hadn't really been vetted maybe as well as they could have been, joining the core maintenance team, keeping an eye out for those sort of behaviors. It's hindsight, right? Like we could talk about this all day long, but this was sort of a new tack, a new approach.
The interesting thing that I think has always been tough for me to understand about this, and it's one of those things that's just a reality of the world that I wish it was different, is, we have these critical pieces of infrastructure like the XZ. If you take out the malicious actor, that was just a guy doing that as a side hustle for years. Mm-hmm. This code that, is run on enterprise systems around the world every day that powers the largest websites in the world was just, a guy's weekend project. And I think that sometimes is hard to reconcile when we have this big assumption that everything's moving correctly. But the closer you get to open source, the more you learn about community and the way things work. There's almost this weird inversion of some of these most important small pieces are also some of the ones that are the most neglected because they're hidden.
Absolutely. The further down the dependency chain you get, I've saw some statistic, but I can't remember exactly what the number was, but it was alarming. The number of single maintainer projects that are very, very popular was more than 50% of like the critical projects as judged by, I want to say it was OpenSSF did some research into this, and it was a scary amount of projects are single maintainer projects. And how do you approach that? How do you help? How do you offer help to even 1,000 single maintainer projects that are critical, and do it in a way that actually benefits the community, that is not biased towards one organization or another? I mean, I know foundations have do a lot of work in this space, and not every community or every single maintainer wants to be involved in something like that, or can be involved in something like that. And also, they don't want to give up the project because it's theirs and there's no requirement to. So it's a balancing act, right? There's again, the implicit and explicit ways to contribute. And then there's the ways that we wish we were able to contribute and support some of these single maintainer projects. Not everybody's agrees on what security controls need to be in place for particular projects or particular package managers even. And there's nothing stopping, anybody from just taking their toys and going home at that point, because it is free and without warranty to use this individual's project.
And it's one thing, you kind of know that happens generally, but it's not something that you run into super often as someone who works in corporate open source, because quite frankly, corporate open source policy offices are not committing to those single maintainer projects, either because it's not a focus or as we've discovered a few times, because they're a single maintainer project because they want to be. Mm-hmm. And one thing I've run into, and I'm not going to name this project because it's a very good project people work on, the person who works on it is pretty nice, but I recently got onto their mailing list, and what I'm seeing is posts from people saying, I posted this patch 3 months ago, will you please review this? And people just pushing this, and it's very clear that the maintainer doesn't have time to field all of these. And so it becomes interesting and almost becomes existential, right? If you use a project that depends on this sort of single maintainer project, then do you even really have a project? Does the redundancy you built in your project matter if you have that, one technical leg that everything is balancing on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's some of the work that GR-OSS does, right? Is we take some of those projects and where it's obvious that there's not a ton of interaction, that we're not necessarily getting what we need from the maintainer. Now we have to build it ourselves and then create forks, and that's unfortunate because the work that our engineers do could go back and benefit the larger community, and at the same time, that's how this works. That's the agreement of all of this, is that we can take that and do that work on our own.
I mean, and to be clear, there's positive examples of that with GR-OSS as well. We had Itamar on a podcast a few months ago, and, he's been one of the people who's taken up the mantle of trying to keep Eventlet alive long enough for the projects that use it to migrate off of it. And that was the situation of a single maintainer project that recognized that they didn't have the time, and they handed over the keys to people who did. So that's... don't want to just have it be all negative about that stuff, because there are a lot of people out there who are sacrificing their time, who really care, and would love to get those PRs even though they don't.
There's a lot of cognitive labor that goes on with that too. If you're, I've spoken to a number of single maintainers on projects that it becomes a point of like overwhelming, and it almost becomes like they avoid going and checking on it because they know it's outstanding. And it just creates like just a backlog in their mind that's constantly sitting there of, oh yeah, I know, I just saw another issue come in. I can't even think about that right now. I'm so busy with my paying job. And so now they've got all of this negative feelings, not to get too squishy about it, but there's that matters, right? And so how do you help alleviate some of that stress for an individual that's too busy to even approach the work in front of them, that they're out of time, for what their real responsibilities. So they are still responsible to this, but to the more pressing responsibilities, I guess I'm saying. They don't want the help because at that point they're thinking it's going to take way too long for me to parse all of this out to find the right help for this. It's impossible, I feel like, sometimes to know whether or not a project that you're putting online for others to consume has the potential really to be something that could be one of these, could be that bottom box in the XKCD, comic, where the entire world's infrastructure is depending on the one guy in Nebraska. You don't know from the outset that you're going to be the one guy in Nebraska and that your project's going to end up there, right? But maybe it's a good exercise, and maybe this is something that we can, bring more awareness to. Is, hey, maybe think about what it looks like if you don't want to do this anymore. But think about it when you start.
Yeah, that was actually a big topic last week. We were talking about foundations almost being like, community is, sort of squishy bits. It's the human interactions and all that. And foundations are sort of the business side of that continuity and making sure. But that's definitely a problem that's going to be ongoing. And I don't think there's a silver bullet. I personally know people who've been on single maintainer projects who, they'll read the blog post saying, pay all the developers. And they'll go, I don't want to get paid. I don't want this to be my job. This is just a fun thing that I'm doing. I didn't ask for all these people to rely on it. And so there's a very interesting tightrope that you have to walk there to sort of avoid giving someone a bad experience. But we don't want that to happen, but we know it always happens, right? When you're an open source, there's going to be a gross moment. Maybe you screw up, someone else screws up, something happens, and you've got to overcome that. And, we like emphasizing here that, it is a struggle. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic solution that makes it easy. It's hard. And so we like to share those stories of how it's hard with a little bit of gross out story time. And so you maybe have a story of kind of a gross moment in open source that happened to you or you were involved in and how it was overcome.
I think one of the things that has been, that's a challenge. It's a lot of this work is just rolling up your sleeves and being okay with being the person that cleans the kitchen. Somebody's got to clean the kitchen. Somebody's got to go in and tighten up the documentation to make sure that points are met, or that you're explicitly saying, we don't want contributions on this project. Thank you so much. We don't want them, making sure that it's clear for folks that stumble across that project. So getting wrangling all that needs to be, or that can be in place to support growth of a community is kind of daunting when you look at all the metrics that are out there and evaluating your project. And as a maintainer, I have definitely understood that getting an influx from some rando on the internet running a scanner against your project and saying, hey, you need to add these 10 things. Can you turn this on? This particular organization says that by this thing, you should do X, Y, Z, and I'm nobody. That's not particularly helpful. However, doing that on an enterprise level and doing it for an organization and saying, hey, these projects that we're ingesting are missing these things, we probably want to tighten them up on our own and maybe suggest them to the maintainer if this is something that we want to continue using. So I guess that's probably, being it's a lot of behind the scenes work. There's no immutable record of my contributions because largely it's, hey, this is what's missing. I can't do it for you, or this is the best standard that is available, or I've identified that this project needs help. Let's get you some help on this project. But being willing to do those things. You said something
there that I think is interesting and maybe is gross on its own, right? Like you sort of even downplayed your own contributions as a community person as like, oh, these are softer things. But that's actually one of the grossest things in open source, I think, is that oftentimes the people who do that emotional labor of, answering issues or redirecting new users to better forums or, any number of these things that have to be done, that those kitchen cleaning activities that don't always get recognized as contribution, right? Like you can contribute to a project in lots of ways that will never show up on a GitHub profile or in a Git log.
Yeah. No, and I don't mean to diminish it at all, because it is important work. And largely the folks that I interact with in the open source ecosystem are doing similar things, talking about projects, even just building awareness about a project is not something that you're going to find in your GitHub history. You don't get a little green block for that. You don't get a green block for having a conversation with somebody, a coworker, when you find out that there's an open source solution to the challenge that they're having. That's not something that shows up in GitHub, but it brings awareness and adoption to that project, which for a lot of projects, adoption is just as helpful as contributions are, as code contributions are, because that's where, reality meets, thought. and you don't know what kind of feedback you're going to get until it's actually in practice and in place. So things even like promoting adoption can be part of the whole contribution process that's not recognized. I think you've referred to it before, and I've seen it online, as like keeping the community commons, right? These are all things that have to be done in order for the open source ecosystem to work smoothly and for us to work together and to grow these communities. And it takes all of us to do a little bit of it. Many hands make the load lighter. If we're all kind of keeping an eye out for these common issues that occur across projects, identifying where contribution guidelines aren't really spelled out, so it's unclear if you want your project contributed to or not. If you've gotten an answer from a contributor that says no, we don't want contributions, well, maybe write that up in their contribution policy, and just as one ironic PR, make it explicit for other people so they don't make the same mistake you just did.
I love that idea. That is, we don't allow contributions. A PR to your contributor document saying that's
it would be
great.
Helpful, right?
Oh, absolutely, because it is much worse to be strung along by slow reviews, by people acting like they want your code, but they're not prioritizing getting it in. That's almost a little more frustrating because you still have hope.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I'm glad we're going to end on that point, because I think it's really good. It reemphasizes the stuff that G-Research open source software does, because we do try to be one of those hands in there, right? Like if we can have, if G-Research can do their part as a corporate user and other corporations are willing to pitch in and do their part, we're going to eliminate more and more of these situations through having, the actual business interest in these, dependency 7 layers down the chain being necessary. So I'm grateful to them for that, for employing me, for employing you to do these things, for letting us do this podcast. So if you're listening to this, you're looking for work in London, UK, or Dallas, Texas, we're going to have links to the open positions at G-Research down below. If you want to work for a company that appreciates open source, please do hit the like button, subscribe if you're on YouTube, leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. These are very meaningful things to us as we're trying to get going early on. And thank you for spending time with us today. I'm Jay Faulkner on behalf of Tabatha. Thank you very much for tuning in to the G-Research Open Source Podcast. Have a good one.